All right, welcome to CHI's Beyond Belief. This is week 4, and we'll be focusing today on resignation from Paul Ricoeur's essay, Religion, Atheism, and Faith. Last week what we did is discuss the desire for consolation and the way that the desire for consolation is connected to a logic of retribution. If you want to be consoled, the way that that generally works out is that you have the God of love, where you have justice, where you have a sense of providence, and all of these kind of merge in this metaphysical backdrop or in this worldview that makes sure that the righteous benefit and the wicked suffer. That's the God of retribution, right? So if you're suffering and you want your suffering to have some sort of meaning, if you want it to be redeemed, you need this framework. The problem is that that is very, very punitive. And so, although we want a world of consolation, we want a world in where justice wins, ultimately, it's still tied to corrupt elements in religion. And for Ricoeur, we need to get rid of it. Last week, we also discussed the vision of a tragic faith, which moves forward while embracing life's disappointments and injustices without flinching. It moves away from the illusion of protection, and it denies the consolations offered by an external source of meaning or justice. And Ricoeur's big example for that was the faith of Job, which he called a tragic faith. This week, we're, like I said, talking about resignation and how it relates to both consolation and consent. And the 4 major things that we'll be looking over. Number 1, the way that word comes from beyond the naive need for consolation. So we're going to go back to Heidegger and language. 2, we'll look at resignation and its relationship to faith. And that will require a brief detour away from Ricoeur and into Kierkegaard. So we'll take that little detour, just to give you a heads up. Number 3, we'll go back to Ricoeur and look at how the act of consent differs from the desire for protection. And number 4, we'll introduce a new mode of consolation that emerges in a language that's stripped of our own narcissistic demands. So we keep going back to language, and language keeps doing more and more for us as long as we're willing to hearken to it. So on page 460, Ricoeur talks about the role of the philosopher. And this kind of brings the reader back to the introduction, where he talks about how the philosopher thinks in the intermediate time between nihilism and purified faith. He had earlier talked about atheism as being a period of confusion, and he's defining it a little bit more clearly as the gap between nihilism and faith. To think, he says, is to dig deeper until one reaches the level of questioning that makes possible a mediation between religion and faith by means of atheism. And so, again, that's the goal. If atheism ends up erupting in nihilism, nobody wants to stay nihilistic. What we want to do is move past that into faith, and that's what he's trying to do. So he then talks about word beyond consolation. He ventures that our relationship to word, to language, offers a model for, quote, an obedience to being beyond all fear of punishment, beyond all prohibition and condemnation. His goal is to discover in this obedience the source of a consolation that would be just as far removed from the infantile desire for protection as obedience is from all fear of punishment. So earlier in the essay, just as a brief review, he talked about how hearkening to word, how to hearken, it opens up a kind of obedience where you attend to language, right? And so just when somebody says something, when language speaks out, when language occurs, it provides you a mode of obedience which is not, it's not tied to rebellion, and it's not tied to submission. It's an obedience that's purified from all of that, and therefore also from all sorts of punishment. And so what he's trying to do now is to say, great, well, this also works not just for the fear of punishment, but it also works for the desire for consolation at a deeper level, at a better level. So that's what he's looking for. So the relationship to word, and we're on page 461 now, does 3 things for Ricoeur. Number 1, it neutralizes all accusation, which we just went over there, and therefore also all fear. Number 2, it brackets the desire for protection and eliminates the narcissism of desire. And number 3, it opens up, quote, a realm of meaning in which there is no longer a question of myself, but only of being as such. The totality of being is manifested in the forgetting of my own desires and interests. And so that's the relationship that he wants to sketch out. He wants to argue that there's something in language that allows us to connect with being in a different way than what the ordinary, like this kind of constellation will offer, right? So that's the trajectory that he's heading toward. All right. Number 2, resignation. Ricoeur relates this, quote, impersonal unfolding of being, unquote, in language, which offers the, quote, absence of personal concerns and the fullness of word to the ending of the book of Job. All right, so again, the story of Job. Job's a righteous man. God and Satan make a bet to see that Satan says he can cause Job to curse God and die. Kills all his kids, takes all his possessions, destroys his health. He's just sitting there like scraping his skin off, sitting in a pile of ash. His 3 friends come and say, yeah, dude, you screwed up. I mean, this is providence. Clearly, if you were righteous and just, you wouldn't be suffering. And Job just kind of ignores them. And at the end of the book, he demands of God to know what's going on. And God comes down and says, yeah, check out nature. Nature's awesome. Look at the Leviathan. Look at the behemoth. Were you there when you created the fountains of the ocean? It just goes on and on and on. But it's kind of non-responsive, right? God's answer occurs in language, but there's no response to the human desire for protection or consolation. Right? Clearly, God in no way protects Job from suffering. Job suffers, right? That's the meaning of his life. And God doesn't care about consolation, right? There's nothing redemptive about it. God's just kind of showing off how cool the world is. And here's all the neat things. So Ricoeur says this, quote, no teleology emerges from the whirlwind. No intelligible connection is established between the physical order and the ethical order. What remains is the unfolding of being within the fullness of word. What remains is only the possibility of an active acceptance, which would be the first step in the direction of consolation, the first step beyond the desire for protection. And again, you have to be a little bit careful because he's using consolation in 2 different senses. Consolation 1 functions in this one. Right? You want the God of justice. And what he wants to connect to, and we'll deal with this in a few minutes, is the connection of the physical plus ethical equals God. Right? There's some sort of moral order in the universe that nature also participates in and follows, right? And God's kind of the anchor point or the nexus between them that makes it all hang together. Right? And so that's one version of consolation. What Ricoeur is trying to do is show a path to mode of consolation that's purified of that. Right? How can we have consolation without needing to relieve ourselves of suffering or to look for a justice beyond what we've experienced? And so that's the kind of question that he's looking for. All right. Everybody okay with that for now? All right. I'll get a drink, and then I'll erase the board. And then we'll talk about Kierkegaard. 2 are up in big letters, so you don't confuse this with the actual text or Ricoeur. It's a detour. Resignation via Kierkegaard. All right. So I just watched Wayne's World for the first time with my daughter, who is 10 years of age, and she thought it was the world's stupidest movie. And then she really liked it. And like last night, she was like, all I want to do is watch Wayne's World again. And I was like, mission accomplished as a parent. But Wayne's World is actually my first introduction to Kierkegaard because Wayne cites Kierkegaard when speaking in Cantonese with Cassandra while they're waiting in line for the restroom. Beyond that, he's also a Danish theologian, well known for his philosophical and theological writings, considered an existentialist, forerunner to a lot of the 20th century greats, and really reviled in his own times. Super, super funny, super, super witty, really interesting guy. He's kind of long-winded at some points, but when he's on, he's totally on. Super worth reading. All right. In terms of resignation, though, Kierkegaard really establishes the connection between resignation and faith. Ricoeur, for whatever reason, probably because he's already imported a ton of philosophy into a very, very short, dense article, doesn't dive into it. But in Fear and Trembling, which is one of Kierkegaard's books, Kierkegaard interprets the story of Abraham is one that violates the ethical order, right? So everybody's like, oh, Abraham's the father of faith. What a cool, loving, awesome dude Abraham is. And they kind of neglect the fact that he wants to kill his own kid. You know, Isaac's maybe about Ethan's age, very young, very small. And Abraham's just going to kill him. You know, Dylan talks about this. You know, God said to Abraham, kill my kid. And nobody finds it problematic, right? And like, everybody's like, oh, yeah, go Abraham, Father Abraham had many sons, blah, blah, blah. Except the one he's going to kill, right? And this frustrates Kierkegaard to no end. How can you not look at Abraham as being a monster? A total monster. And so what he does is this. He says, okay, so we have Abraham, who has a direct revelation from God to do something that's absolutely opposed to the ethical order. And what that means, ethics for Kierkegaard assumes the universal. Within the culture, ethics is universally understood, right? You might not agree with it or disagree, but more or less we understand not killing one's child to be a universal ethical norm. You just don't do it. Unless you're like one of the Greek heroes or something like you have to slay your daughter in order to have favorable winds or whatnot. I mean, sometimes it happens, but that's an exception to the universal order. And what Kierkegaard wants to do is contrast the ethical relationship to the universal with the religious orientation to the absolute. Right? So where there's a universal order, that can only be violated by virtue of the absolute. So God has an absolute, you need to have an absolute relationship with the absolute, which is God. And then you should probably follow the ethical. Right? And for him, this is his only way of trying to figure out how Abraham can be held up as a paragon of faith despite being ethically inhuman. Does that make sense? Fear and Trembling is a great book. I highly recommend that you check it out sometime. Anyway, okay. So Kierkegaard calls Abraham a knight of faith, and this is a designation that makes sense against his depiction of the knight of infinite resignation. So Kierkegaard argues that Abraham is called to sacrifice both his son and the future that his son symbolized, right? Abraham's covenant with God was bound up in Isaac, right? Isaac is the symbol of the promise that he'll be the father of multitudes, and that's the very one that he's supposed to kill. So the request this request was made him pushed Abraham to make an infinite sacrifice, right? He's sacrificing everything. All the eggs are being destroyed in one basket. That's kind of a mixed metaphor, but you get my meaning? Okay, excellent. It's at this point that Kierkegaard pauses, though, right? So we have this monstrous sacrifice. You have this infinite sacrifice, and Kierkegaard pauses and describes the night of infinite resignation, right? He muses about what would happen if Abraham had stopped there, right? Resigned himself to giving up his son. This is actually how he starts the book. And even like the first 6 pages of Fear and Trembling, very, very worth reading. But the Abraham that resigns himself to Isaac's death, once Isaac isn't demanded of him, like what do you do with your kid? Like you've resigned yourself to killing him. Now you have your kid back? There's no joy. You kind of hate that kid. You're like, because it's a reminder that you're a monster. And that's all you have with you, right? And so he talks about the night of infinite resignation in fantastic ways. I mean, it's the kind of starry, dreamy-eyed poet, like the one who's willing to sacrifice everything for art. You know, they kind of walk with their feet above the ground a little bit because they're infinitely sacrificing all the time. They probably drink at the Foxhead, maybe at George's sometimes, but that's a little earthier, right? You know, they're very esoteric, very deep. Everybody's drawn to them in their melancholy because it's an infinite melancholy, right? And before the infinite resignation, they're really just kind of boring normal people. Then they infinitely resign something, and then suddenly they're very deep. But for Kierkegaard, what's important about that is to demonstrate that that's not what Abraham does, right? Abraham receives Isaac back without missing a beat. And it's by the virtue of the absurd that Abraham is willing to do this. He goes up. It's not like he's holding back. He's not like he doesn't think he's going to sacrifice. He thinks he's going to sacrifice. He makes the infinite resignation, but then he drops back down into the finite world. without missing a step. He makes his second movement beyond resignation into the world that Kierkegaard describes as faith. So the night of infinite resignation, they're strong enough to respect the summons of sacrifice, but they're not strong enough to have a faith grounded in finitude, right? Or in that's in the finite. We'll put it that way instead of saying the word infinitude in two different ways in the same sentence. So it's for this reason. I mean, when he describes faith, he describes it as the night of faith is indistinguishable from a wealthy burgher in Copenhagen dreaming of lands heaped with vegetables for dinner. Right? It's just a sturdy person. Like, you'd overlook the night of faith. You'd never recognize Abraham in a million years because he looks just like the normal person. He's totally grounded in the finite world. Right? There's no hints of the infinite there because that movement back down to earth is fully and wholly made. But it has to be, it's indirect, right? So he looks like the burger, but he's not. He's a knight of faith, but you just never can see him. Does that make sense? Okay. And that's how Abraham, by virtue of the reserve, manages to move past resignation to faith, which allows him to ultimately embrace his unslaughtered son and become a hero in the Christian scriptures and in the Hebrew Bible, and not just an absolute monster. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, that was our detour. Now let's go back to Ricoeur. I'll erase Kierkegaard. Back to Ricoeur. So, I don't think it's a coincidence that Ricoeur associates resignation with a non-ethical order. Right? Anytime you're going to resign yourself infinitely, it's going to have to be in a non-ethical order. Does that make sense? The world of ethics is universal. And what resignation does is cancels that out and it tries for something different. At least this kind of resignation, right? It's at odds with the ethical order. And I can only assume that Ricoeur has that kind of in the background as he's writing. And it's also not a coincidence that this is just the first step, right? You have to know how to resign before you can move forward. It's got to happen in that order. So Ricoeur doesn't follow Kierkegaard here. Instead, he still wanders through the paths that were explored by Heidegger concerning language. So he writes that God's non-reply to Job shows how resignation leads to consolation, inasmuch as, quote, this non-ethical order is not alien to word, and in spite of the fact that it is alien to my own narcissistic interests. So Job witnesses a revelation of the whole. His voice has, okay, let me break it down. So when you have word or language, or especially the word, the speech that God makes to Job, there's nothing about Job in there. It has nothing to do with Job at all, right? There's nothing Joby anywhere in the thing. So it's alien to Job's interests, the way that all language is abstract, right? And the abstraction of language means that it's never really yours. Word as such you can't have a narcissistic connection to language, right? Even to your own name. Language escapes us in that way. It's impersonal. We appropriate it, but it's impersonal. The other part of it is that it's still within the non-ethical order, though, right? So if we root it in language, language precedes the ethical in a way that allows us to use word as a way to get to that kind of point, that non-ethical, non-narcissistic point of resignation. Does that make sense?
Can you go back just a second? I missed that last bit.
Yeah. So word allows us to escape or to have both a non-narcissistic and a non-ethical mode of comportment or a way to go about doing things. Does that make sense? Okay. Secondly, Job witnesses the revelation of the whole as voice, not spectacle. Right? It's not like God pulls out his Blu-ray player and pans around like, oh, here's Leviathan, check that out. Here's Behemoth last year. It's it's something like that. God's just talking, right? And the totality of the universe that Job experiences in God's speech isn't shown to him. It's told to him. It occurs as hearing, not as vision. Right? And I mean, really basically, when we see things, we tend to see things, and we're in control of that as the center, right? I mean, it's the fancy term for that is ocular centrism, right? You know, I am in the middle of everything that I see, everything that it's Yertle the turtle's the other, you know, right? Everything I see is mine. But voice comes from outside. It decenters you. You're not at the center of where it's speaking. You're hearing something that you're not at the center of. It dislocates you from the center. And automatically, when you attend it to reality through hearkening instead of through seeing, it decenters you. You're not in control of it. It's a more humble attitude automatically. But it's also total, right? When you truly hearken to something, I mean, when you're seeing things, you're always seeing things in time. And when you hear things, you hear them in time too. But the way that word functions, again, you don't have control of it. So you have to center yourself into the moment that word speaks, into its occurrence. Because its occurrence is fleeting. It just goes away, just like that. Right? Words disappear as we listen. And things move, and we can follow them with our eyes, but you have to attend to word in a different way than you attend to sing. Does that make sense? Okay. So Ricoeur writes this. He says, quote, "The occurrence of word as such creates a link. Dialogue is in itself a mode of consolation. Hearkening to word makes possible the view of the world as an ordered whole. So the fact that you're in dialogue with language at all is consoling. You're not alone. You might be suffering, but you're not alone. And that's the gift of language. That's the gift of dialogue. And from Ricoeur's interpretation, that's the message that God's speech to Job offers. It's a consolation that has nothing to do with protection, clearly. Right? And it's not consoling in terms of a larger sense of justice that has Job's narcissistic interest in mind. It's nothing ethical. But there's a peace that Job finds in God's speech anyway. All right. Does that relationship with language make sense? Okay. We're on page 462 now. And the next step of the argument, Ricoeur talks about consent. This emerges through a quick investigation of the pre-Socratic thinkers. Ricoeur interprets their meaning as a way to think of consolation through the unity of being and logos. Okay, so you have consolation, which emerges as a connection between being and logos instead of nature or the physical world and ethics. Right? That's the transition that he's trying to make. We don't need to worry about a God that connects nature and ethics anymore. Whether or not there's a God, we still have a kind of connection between being and logos, and that's one that naturally emerges given our character as Dasein or human beings. We're speaking beings, and the being in language like there's something consoling about being spoken with, dialogue. We belong to language insofar as we speak. To quote, "Because my own speech belongs to word, I no longer demand that my desire be reconciled within the order of language. Within the order of nature." Right? My own speech participates in word itself, and that means I no longer have to demand an ethics that's imposed over the physical world. I can console myself with being a speaking being in a world where speech is important as a part of the world that I dwell within. We live in a language world, not just a physical one, and so Ricoeur is trying to shift the register in this way. Ricoeur asserts that in this sort of belonging resides the origin not only of obedience beyond fear, but of consent beyond desire. I'll explain this. Page 463. Actually, Ricoeur will explain it, and I'll just talk about how Ricoeur explains it, and we'll go from there. Ricoeur wants to use the act of consent as an antidote to the desire for protection. So last week we talked about how the desire for protection, according to Freud, is a really pernicious part of religion, right? You desire protection, and it ends up as a sort of wish fulfillment and a product of the pleasure principle. That was last week. So rather than the desire for protection, he still wants to account for things. And again, he's still trying to sketch out what kind of faith is possible beyond religion that still kind of attends to those basic human needs. So the way he wants to attend to the desire for protection is instead offer the act of consent. Right? A desire is something that we innately are attuned to, like, oh, I want this, I want that. I mean, at any given time, I want coffee and some sort of nice pastry. Like, I always desire these things. They're always there. But that's different than acting, right? To act is something that I can intentionally do, whereas the desire for coffee or a pastry just grabs me, right? It puts the ball more in my court a little bit that way. So Ricoeur argues, quote, the type of metaphysics that's involved here is that which tries to relate value and fact, which is another way of restating nature and ethics, value and fact within a system that we would like to call the meaning of the universe or the meaning of life. Right? So it's when we gather value and fact, value plus fact equals meaning. Right? The fact is this happened. The value of it is this. The value gives it some sort of meaning or some sort of external way that it's redeemable beyond just the fact of it. Does that make sense? Okay. In such a system, the natural order and the ethical order are unified in a higher totality. Following Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, Ricoeur finds that presupposing a primordial bond of value and fact is a mistake, which shouldn't be a surprise by this point because he's gone through Nietzsche and Freud and finds that that kind of desire to have this value plus fact God nexus thing is just projection and wish fulfillment. Right? It's slave morality. It's not authentic. It's not genuine. It's corrupt. And he wants to purify it of its corruption. But Ricoeur develops the critique further, still following Heidegger. And he writes that we become ensnared in problems when attempting to hold a subject who wills value against a world of appearances that lack them, a world that's mere facts. Nihilism, which that is, for Ricoeur, quote, reveals the failure of the God of metaphysics to effect this reconciliation, the failure of all attempts to fulfill causality within a teleological scheme. Right, and there's another opposition, right? You want to have a cause for all of the effects that come out. And if God is the cause, then everything's just gravy, right? But for Ricoeur, it doesn't work in terms of those who want to will value against the world of appearances that lack them, right? So if you say, oh, there's no meaning in the world, everything is just fact and appearance, I will impose with will value upon them and just judge things. I mean, you can do that, but that's, for Ricoeur, not the most proper way of being. Ricoeur doesn't spell this out, but I believe that nihilism becomes the ultimate stage of resignation. One resigns oneself to the gap that separates value from fact, and then seeks to dwell within it. The way to live within the gap is to embrace the lack of coherence through rebellion against the religious systems that would support it, right? And so if the religious systems hold these things as being together through God in order to get to meaning, right? God is cause, meaning is the telos or the aim, right? So, and then we have our nihilists here who just want to rail against here and who also are willing to sacrifice that. Does that make sense? I mean, that's nihilism in a nutshell. But that's also a mode of resignation, right? I'm resigned to the fact that there's no type of coherence possible. In order to allow myself to do something, I'll just will myself against it, right? I'll give up. I'll infinitely give up the hope of this, resign myself to it, and just smash everything around me nihilistically. There's no meaning anywhere. This type of rebellion, however, is not substantially better than the preceding step of obedience. Put otherwise, if denial is a return to religion after a confrontation with atheism, right? If I want to say, oh, I get the fact that value plus fact doesn't equal meaning, but I really, really want it to. So I'm just going to deny the fact that I learned that. So if that's denial, then anger becomes a resignation to the loss and an attempt to benefit anyway. And that's just the stages of grieving, right? You go through denial to anger, and there you go. I mean, there's the return back to religion, and here's my nihilism. But it falls short of a true acceptance, because acceptance only comes with an act of consent. And here's where we come back to consent. So the solution for Ricoeur is to find a point that precedes the dichotomy of subject and object, teleology and causality, human and world. Right? These are all these kinds of divisions that we're confronted with that are agonizing to us. And so Ricoeur, rather than wanting to pretend like, no, they're really together, or to manufacture some sort of being that holds them in a higher unity, he wants to shift his perspective in order to find a point that precedes the point where subject and object break away, right? Before there's a gap between human and world. And that gap is language. He writes, quote, "This point is the manifestation of being as the logos that gathers all things." And for Heidegger, and Ricoeur follows him in this, logos has a centripetal, I think is the term, right? It's inward moving, right? Language gathers. Is the way that you hear a word and it gathers you into it, right? You attend it to it. If you hear your name called, it gathers you into it. If you hear of a conversation, I used to wait tables, and it would be great when people are having an argument because you can see their words gathering everybody in the restaurant who slowly started listening to more and more of the conversation. Word gathers, and whether it's a street preacher or a fight in a restaurant or whatever it is, language has the capacity to gather us together. And that kind of gathering precedes the subject-object split, right? The same way when you hearken to something, it precedes your need to either comply or rebel. That's the beauty of language. It's a thing that gathers. So the gathering function of language, the way that it collects and coalesces being within its sounding, provides an alternative to human willing, right? And again, the nihilists are all about the will. Oh, this is what I will do, or I will do this. There's no meaning to anything, so I will do whatever I want, and I will reshape ethics or society or the rules however I want because there's no meaning to them anyway. So rather than that angry oppositional will, Ricoeur wants us to be gathered into language. If humans are humans only when they're gathered by the logos, which gathers all things, then for Ricoeur, quote, "a kind of consolation is possible, which is nothing less than the happiness of belonging to the logos and to being as logos." That's the magic of consolation. We belong. We have a place. We're gathered into a space or into an event or into an occurrence as language. And it's fleeting because voice is temporary, right? It's nothing permanent. But in that moment, you experience this transitory, temporary consolation that's a kind of happiness. And it's not a narcissistic happiness, right? It's not a happiness that's about me. It's a happiness that allows me to be rooted in that which I also am. That isn't about me, right? It's the impersonal nature of language kind of has that neat side effect to it. Happiness here then comes with belonging. It comes with an act whereby we consent to belong at this level. And not demand anything else, not demand anything more. It's a way that we can move forward past the angry nihilism of resignation and its despair to become uniquely capable of dwelling wholly in the world. Because again, the only way we have access to the world as totality is through language. It's through word. It's that spectacle that Job receives that isn't visual at all, right? The whole of reality is given to him. He receives the totality through language. And for Ricoeur, that's our consolation. It's our belonging there. It's finding our home there. It's learning how to dwell there more and more often. And with that act of consent, we don't have to just merely resign ourselves the way the Knight of Infinite Resignation resigns himself, right? It roots us and it anchors us in the very, very finite, in that very, very temporary and transitory moment of language when voice speaks and we hearken. Are there any questions? Andrew?
Back to us. I'm just thinking through this. I'm a little hung up on the language that comes before the subject-object split as we're looking in. I mean, I'm just thinking of the way the language introduces the subject-object split and also introduces the split in the subject.
Yeah, no, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I think what he's looking at is, again, it's the difference between the visual and the auditory, right? So if I'm looking at things, here's the object, X, and that's not me. And when I hear things, what's in here? Sorry about that, I didn't mean to make it a picture. Right, when I hear things, what I hear is part of me. I'm participating in its hearing, right? And it's not as distant to me because I hear it. I don't see it as outside of me. I hear it within me, and I'm already participating within it. And I think that's what he's talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Language isn't an object that I hear. I experience the utterance as it is spoken. And I participate with it at that level. And so it precedes this, oh, there's this stuff. I mean, it just kind of simplifies that whole process. And I mean, other problems come later. I mean, I understand language and whatnot, but I think that's the really basic level at which he's talking.
I think the way that you talk about language gathering also, so I mean, it shifts it to a different register.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of like how that register is related. I'm not ready to formulate a question yet.
Okay. You can always post it later on the forum. All right, other questions?
I got nothing for you.
All right. Live long and hearken. Thanks for coming.